So thanks so much for joining our latest edition of Passions in Practice. I'm very excited to welcome Abby Katz with us tonight. Abby, I'm linked to Abby or following Abby on LinkedIn, and I've seen a lot of her presentations that she's done and some of the research that she's been working on, and have been really fascinated from afar. And this was really a perfect opportunity for us to invite her to share some of the work that she's been doing and just educate us on thinking about marketing for food and how that all looks in this day and age. So I'm really excited to welcome Abby. We've got, for those of you who give questions in advance, we have those. We'll get to them at the end. At the bottom here, there's also a Q&A box. So if you have questions as Abby is presenting, please add them into the Q&A and we'll get those at the end. But right now, excited to welcome Abby to share some thoughts on food marketing. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to get started by sharing my screen. There we are. So welcome everyone. Thanks for joining me this evening. My name is Abby Katz. I'm a graduate from the class of 2015 from Govs, and now I am a third year, or rather rising fourth year PhD student in behavioral and social health sciences at the Brown University School of Public Health. I'm here pursuing my PhD, and so a lot of the work that I'll be talking about today is research that I've been diving into to help shape my dissertation research, which I'll talk a teeny bit about the plan for that later on. But overall, I'm hoping that this presentation really kind of gives you a brief overview of the politics of food and how that incentivizes food marketing, and furthermore, how food marketing really influences the dietary behavior and diets of adolescents or teens. So let's just jump right into it. I want to start with a teeny bit more of an introduction about myself. And so if you're from either of these places, maybe you recognize the cities in these photos. On the top, it's a photo of Lawrence, Massachusetts. It's a pretty big city that I spent a good amount of my young childhood in growing up. And on the bottom, it's a photo of Portsmouth, New Hampshire, which is another place that I spent a lot of my youth in. I was raised between two homes. One was with my mom, who's of Afro-Ecuadorian descent, and we lived in Lawrence, and she was living paycheck to paycheck. Versus in Portsmouth, I was living with my grandparents. They're my mom's adoptive parents. They're white, and they have more monetary resources. And as a kid, I really didn't think a lot about these differences between these two places. It really wasn't something that affected my life on a day-to-day, or at least not in a way that I was aware of. But it was something I started to become aware of around age 12, so just before I got to Govs, when I decided to become a vegetarian. And it was really interesting because my mom couldn't really understand that choice culturally, and she couldn't support it on a limited budget. And we didn't really have access to specialty foods to supplement my diet in a way that would still kind of promote health and well-being for a growing kid. Versus my grandparents were pretty, supportive. They knew what vegetarianism was. They understood it, and they were near specialty groceries or grocers, farmers markets. And so spending money on specialty groceries was a regular expense. And growing up, like I said, I wasn't entirely aware of it at the time, but in contemplating the duality I grew up with, I really sought language to describe the disparate food environment conditions that I grew up in, those cultural conditions that were different across both places I lived, but also the literal physical environment, what I had access to. And I really just developed a curiosity about these inequities, why they exist, and how they influence food choices and health outcomes. So again, just showing you a little bit more concretely by the numbers how these two places really differ. And so you can see in Lawrence, the estimated median household income is less than $50,000 versus close to 95,000 in Portsmouth. Per capita income is close to $20,000 in Lawrence versus 64 in Portsmouth. But interestingly, the cost of living index is the same in both places. So in both places, people are still really struggling to meet their basic needs. So like I said, I developed this curiosity and that kind of set me on this interesting academic trajectory after I graduated from Govs. So I went to UConn for undergrad, and there I pursued a Bachelor of Arts, and it was actually an individualized major called Food, Culture, and Sustainable Society. And I also double majored with human rights. And one of the benefits of pursuing an individualized major meant that I really got to curate what my courses looked like. And so I took courses in sociology, geography, agriculture, resource economics, and there was also an applied component required for my human rights degree. And so I needed to do research somewhere or volunteer or whatever it was. And I ended up getting placed in the UConn Red Center for Food Policy and Health. And that was my very first research experience, undergraduate research experience. And that's where I really started to see that food and food marketing was something that people actually did research on to begin with. And from there, I developed a deeper interest in food marketing specifically. The Red Center does have a bunch of different research areas that they focus on. That's just one. But from there, I knew that I wanted to pursue a graduate degree in order to figure out what I would want to do for a doctoral degree. And so I went to NYU and graduated in May 2022 with a Master of Arts in Food Studies. And through NYU, I was able to really hone in on this food marketing focus again, and also got experience doing applied research on food policy and evaluation at NYU Langone Health, which is the affiliated medical center. And then from there, I landed here in Providence. Now I go to Brown, and like I said, I'm studying behavioral science, and I am affiliated with a lab here that my advisor runs called the Social Epidemiology Lab, or Social Epi Lab for short. And really my work here is the product of all of the work I did before, the applied experiences I had working on other people's research projects, and that's what brings me here today. So this is a rough overview of what I'll talk about today. And I have a lot of content, so there may be some things I breeze through a little bit later, but feel free to ask additional questions as the presentation goes on, and we'll try to get to them at the end. This is where I want to start. So when I say the word food marketing, I think a lot of different things can come to mind. And so I think it's helpful to clarify that food marketing and food advertising are distinct concepts. So food marketing is actually an umbrella term that refers to any activities involved in distributing, promoting, and selling a food product. So that can include advertising. Advertising is part of the marketing process, right? But there's other aspects of marketing as well, things like building relationships with consumers, creating brand awareness, and even the strategic placement of products in stores. So when I think about politics of food marketing, I return often when I think about politics of food in general to this quotation by Anthony Bourdain. It says, "There's nothing more political than food. Who eats, who doesn't? Why do people cook what they cook? It is always the end or part of a long story, often a painful one." Now, I won't go too in depth, but just again, want to frame kind of where I'm approaching this topic from by talking a little bit about the political economy of food marketing. So by this, I'm just referring to how capitalism is the world's dominant economic system, certainly the dominant economic system in the United States, and that this really creates a contention between market priorities and public health priorities. So capitalism really dictates or says that production and consumption are controlled by private actors, and that's in order for them to kind of participate in market competition so they can compete to provide the best goods and services. And that really centers efficiency and profit Efficiency and profit, though, are not always aligned with public health priorities, which we'll talk a little bit more about. And importantly, in the 21st century, monopoly market power and the interests, i.e., profit of multinational food corporations, is really what drives our food system in the US and globally. And what this does is it creates an incentive to market products to encourage purchase and consumption. And largely that's for unhealthy foods. I put that in quotation marks because we can talk a little more about that in the questions later, but I'll just say what we generally understand to be unhealthy is usually foods that are high in salt, fat, and sugar. And so those are typically cheaper to produce and easier to distribute. And so that is why marketing tends to be for those products. Finally, corporate power at this point, again, because our food system is largely dictated by the interests of multinational food corporations, is actually has more of an influence than governments or multilateral organizations combined. And so the problem is that corporate power is largely unchecked, and that's led to a lot of challenges in the food marketing sphere and associated health outcomes. So looking at this slide, this is just a figure kind of illustrating multi-level factors that influence diet specifically, and you could broaden that to think about like dietary behavior in general. But I just want to highlight that marketing is one part of a much larger system in terms of factors that influence what people eat. And so things like affordability, availability, environmental and social impact, quality and convenience are all things that people are considering in their day-to-day life when they're making food choices, but also factors that are shaping the conditions that ultimately people have to operate within. So now to talk a little bit more about the food marketing landscape. So the food environment is undergoing a digital transformation. So as someone who's been diving into this literature for a long time, a vast majority of research is really looking at television marketing, especially when we're talking about kids and their exposure to marketing. But now, again, in the 21st century, digital marketing is even more popular. And overall, the food environment is undergoing this digital transformation. So it's all these dimensions of the food environment, whether it's external factors like food availability and food prices, or internal factors, affordability, convenience, desirability, etc. And it's important to note that the physical food environment, so literally where you live, what you have access to, and what you're exposed to in the digital sphere are interconnected and they influence each other. And some of the gaps kind of that researchers are trying to dive into more is really trying to figure out that personal domain parts. You'll see that in the black rectangle near the bottom. So people are really trying to uncover more about what, again, is happening at that person level when someone is deciding to purchase, consume, or even just has the intent to purchase or consume a food. And with digital food marketing comes opportunity. So for corporations, it provides more strategies to promote their products. It provides an opportunity to leverage personal data. So there's a concept called relational marketing where you can use information about a consumer and how they interact on a platform or with your content in order to then better curate your marketing strategy. It also integrates the marketing mix. So if you're familiar with any kind of marketing concepts, these ideas of like the product itself, where it's placed, the price, and how you're promoting it, all of those things are happening in one place in the digital sphere versus the physical food environment. Sometimes you're not getting all of those components at once. And lastly, a really interesting part of digital food marketing in the digital sphere is that enables consumer co-creation. And by that, I mean that consumers are now like engaging with content at a new level. They're not just, liking a post. Sometimes people are making their own videos or reviews of products. And so it's really encouraging people to engage in a way that is very different than it once was before digital marketing was part of the landscape. And I won't go like too in depth on this, but I just want to mention that in the transition from television marketing to digital food marketing, there have been efforts to regulate advertising to children. So I'll just put all these things on the slides here in case you're curious. But what's really interesting is that efforts to regulate advertising to children, again, really started with television, but it wasn't for food marketing necessarily. It was just for ad regulation on TV, period. And over time, there evolved more of an interest in advertising and food marketing. But you'll see on this timeline that there were some key events that really shaped that regulatory landscape for food marketing, namely the under 1974, you'll see the FCC, so the Federal Communications Commission, adopted its first federal policies restricting TV advertising. And there was a lot of progress in the 70s towards regulating advertising, but many of those things were rolled back in the 80s once the Reagan administration was managing the FCC. And so from there, Congress actually didn't approve the Federal Trade Commission's budget either. And they passed something that's kind of confusingly named the FTC Improvements Act that actually removed the FTC's authority to restrict advertising. And it prohibits any further action to adopt proposed children's advertising rules. And then kind of moving into the 90s and early 2000s, by the 90s, we had the Children's Television Act, which required educational programming for children, which is interesting, this kind of like counter marketing approach. And this also limited the amount of commercial time during children's programming. So really important factor. And that's something that's still in place today. But 1998, and the reason why I have the kind of rectangle around this is where Congress passes the Children's Online Privacy Protection Act. And the reason why this is an important thing when we're thinking about digital food marketing is, again, implied in the title. It's about online privacy. And so the argument that was made here was that children under 13 couldn't like consent to sharing their data online. And so COPPA, this policy requires that a website have a privacy policy to begin with, and give specific rules about when and how the company must obtain consent from the child's parent or guardian. And so this is the thing that requires on all these websites, when you make an account, you have to verify if you're 13 and up. This is the piece of legislation that requires that. And so moving into the 2000s, we have seen some interesting kind of self-regulatory actions. So like I said before, corporate power is greater than government power in many cases. And so when there started to be more advocacy to try to regulate food marketing specifically, we saw industry respond by saying, no problem, guys, we'll self-regulate. We'll make sure that we're meeting all these criteria that you care about and protecting young people. And so they developed something called the Children's Food and Beverage Advertising Initiative, which again is a self-regulatory body. And from there, that still exists today. And there are other kind of similar self-regulatory efforts in the food and beverage industries. And to date, COPPA, which I mentioned before, has been kind of adjusted. There's like a COPPA 2.0 now. And so with the changing digital landscape, it was important to kind of reform COPPA. And so some of the new changes in the legislation, it requires parental permission to collect geolocation information, and it identifies as a best practice that companies can no longer collect photos or videos containing a child's image or an audio file with the child's voice unless they gained parental permission. And it also broadens the protection of screen names as personal information. So being able to link like someone's username to their actual name. And it limits the use of any other kind of persistent identifiers to be able to track a user over time or across different websites or online services. So again, this is like specifically around children, but you'll notice if you're an adult watching this, most of you probably are, if not all, that these same kind of restrictions don't apply to you. If you have an iPhone, you've probably seen these messages that ask whether you want to allow your apps to talk to each other and share data. And so that's a very different landscape for adults than it is for kids. But again, this legislation is up to age 13. So anyone between the ages of 13 and 18 are not covered by this legislation. And importantly, industry self-regulation, which is largely how digital food marketing has been regulated. It's not without criticism. We've seen this for the TV example, and I won't go super far in depth, but I'll just say that research has shown that ads have not changed a lot over time, even though companies have said that they would improve the nutritional quality of the foods that they marketed to kids on TV. And so some of the things we can take away are listed here, but importantly, political will, people, plays a large role in shaping industry and government responses. And that's something I'll talk a little bit more about later. So now to talk a little bit more about digital marketing specifically, and also targeted marketing. So types of digital food marketing, this is like as comprehensive as a list as I could try to put together. But I think when we think about digital food marketing, social media advertising is one of those things that first comes to mind, but there's a lot of different things that people are seeing online and things they're seeing ads for online that all kind of fit under this umbrella of digital food marketing. So just to highlight a few things like online video ads through platforms like YouTube or TikTok, email marketing and newsletters, affiliate marketing. People can get pop-ups. There's search engine marketing, so the kinds of optimization of so when you do a search and like the things that pop up at the top, things like that. Giveaways, contests, and we're starting to see more augmented reality marketing, gamified marketing. So some companies have their own websites that are exclusively for kids to play games, branded with all of the company's, logos and colors and things like that. And we see ads even in things like video games, where if you or anyone you know has ever played like 2K, for example, all the side of the basketball court is filled with ads. And so just like it is in real life, it's happening in this digital sphere. Importantly, digital food marketing has really unique features that target youth. And when I refer to targeted marketing, I'm really just talking about directing marketing to a specific population that's typically based on demographics, or it can be other characteristics. But in this case, I'm talking about directing marketing activities towards young people because they are young people. And so some of these unique features, first, ubiquitous connectivity. So you're really connected all the time. And in some cases, it's not just in the digital sphere, it's in real life as well. Geolocation kind of plays into that, where you can be physically can influence what you're seeing on your phone or other devices. Engagement, like I said before, engagement has changed a lot, right? If you were just seeing an ad on TV, you were just seeing it, but now you're inundated with ads on social media and in other digital spaces. And on top of that, people are encouraged to engage. You're encouraged to submit a video to enter into a contest to win a free product, or you're encouraged to, use a hashtag. And so all these different things are shaping engagement in a very different way. And again, in a way that is appealing to young people. User-generated content, like I said, it's not just the ad anymore, but creation and promotion might actually intersect with identity development. So people are seeing people like them in ads and wanting to kind of be like them or resonate with them in some way. And so that creates a different dynamic, again, than you might have seen on television marketing or other traditional marketing. Personalization, like I said, that could be things like based on your activity on a given website, getting prompted to purchase something because maybe you searched it on Google. And so all of those things are taken into account when companies build marketing campaigns, and that's something to keep in mind with young people as well. Social graph really refers to the web of relationships that can be tracked online. So this is not so much about someone's individual behavior, but about the people they interact with and who their actual social network is. And so again, you can track that in the digital sphere. And for young people, they're using social media and other kinds of digital marketing to connect with their social network, and being able to tap into that information, again, can be leveraged to market products. And finally, immersive environments. So like I said, augmented reality and virtual reality are places we're starting to see ads appear as well, and other kinds of marketing activities. And that's becoming increasingly popular kind of platforms for youth to engage with. And marketing is really designed to exploit young people. So it's designed to exploit the developmental stage they're in, using psychological strategies to appeal directly to their emotions and identities. Teens are particularly impressionable, right? And they care a lot about what their peers think and other people around them think. And the part of their brain that allows them to understand kind of long-term impact and make smart decisions is not fully developed. And so it's, again, putting them at risk for persuasive marketing, and it ultimately influencing them to purchase or otherwise consume a marketed product. And finally, social media and digital platforms really create a constant flow, like I said. So it's very ubiquitous. In the 21st century, 97% of teens say that they use the internet every day. And so even if you're not trying that hard, you're surrounded by a lot of this content as a young person. And one thing I really want to note as well when I'm talking about digital marketing is the disproportionate targeting of youth of color and low-income communities. This is important in general to this research area, but also specifically to my research, which I'll talk a little bit more about shortly. But I want to mention that the food industry really strategically targets these vulnerable communities to drive consumption, and it has long-term consequences on health, which we can talk more about in the next section. But teens from communities of color are often targeted not only because they're young people, but also based on race and ethnicity. And part of this is because we, through consumer research, a lot of brands and companies have figured out that teens often kind of build on trends that youth of color start. And so it's in the interest of food and beverage companies to advertise products to youth of color so that they begin using them and encourage other people in their social network and their peers to use those products as well. And like I said, marketing is largely for unhealthy food products, and namely for youth of color. That includes sugary drinks, so things like soda, sports drinks, even like sweetened coffee drinks, and fast food. In terms of lower income communities, they're also more exposed to food marketing, and that's due to the affordability and accessibility of certain food options. So there's some communities across the country that you may have heard kind of the term food desert, but a more accurate term might be a food swamp, where they're actually surrounded by food options, but the food options are largely fast food and don't have, fresh produce and things like that. And finally, marketing creates this cycle of health inequities where lower income teens are more likely to develop these chronic health conditions that are associated with consuming these unhealthy food products due to poor diet choices that ultimately were promoted through ads or other marketing activities. So now to talk a bit more in depth about public health implications. There are some psychological effects of food marketing on teens. Again, teens are being constantly bombarded with food ads and other marketing activities, and that ultimately influences their psychological well-being. It can lead to things like distorted body image, and creating unrealistic standards for what they should be looking like at their age. And further, it can reinforce low self-esteem, again, by promoting that specific body ideal that's associated with certain foods. And finally, eating behaviors. So teens can, or they may develop unhealthy eating habits, things like emotional eating, snacking, or consuming foods with low nutritional value. And so those unhealthy eating patterns are things that aren't just happening on their own, right? The brain is involved in that process. And a lot of these unhealthy food products, these products that are high in fat, salt, and sugar, are addictive in a way. And so once these eating behaviors start, they can be really hard to stop. In terms of physical health risks, increased consumption of these ultra-processed foods, and specifically ultra-processed foods that are also high in fat, salt, and sugar. And I just want to say that because I think a lot of times folks say processed foods are ultra-processed foods, but they don't realize that many of the foods that we consider healthy are processed foods as well. For example, if you were to purchase almond milk, like almond milk does not grow on a tree in a carton. It's a really highly processed food. But in our heads, we don't necessarily kind of define that as an unhealthy food per se. So I just want to name explicitly that that's what I'm referring to as ultra processed foods that are also high in fat, salt, and sugar. And so these foods are things like sugary snacks, fast food, sodas, and all of those can contribute to poor diet. And that ultimately increases the risk of folks developing obesity and other chronic diseases, diet-related diseases. So things like diabetes and heart disease. And these foods can often replace healthier options. And so in the short and long term, that can create nutrition deficiencies, and there are long-term health implications of that as well. And I just wanted to show childhood obesity kind of by the numbers for adolescents. So you get a sense of, again, why my research really focuses on Black and Latino adolescents, but also why kind of in general, these are populations to focus on as well. So you see on this slide that for adolescents 12 to 19, the rate of adolescent obesity is 20.6. And if you compare that kind of specifically by race ethnicities, so the table on the right, you'll see that the burden is disproportionately high for Hispanic and Black youth compared to their white and Asian counterparts. And again, this is important, something we should care about because it has an impact on physical and psychological health, and is associated with non-communicable diseases. So again, things like diabetes, heart disease, cancer, and it's associated with morbid outcomes. So it can even lead to death. So repeated exposure to digital food marketing or just food marketing for unhealthy food in general, it doesn't, just influence one-time decisions when you're seeing an ad. It shapes your food preferences and your consumption habits over time, and it makes it even harder to change those habits as you age. And so for young people, again, because they're particularly susceptible to this persuasive marketing, it makes it hard for them to understand what normal or healthy foods are. It really reframes what they view these things as, and in this case, viewing the unhealthy choices or the less healthy choices as things that are normal and are desirable. And it really encourages them to continue to consume these products over time. But again, like I mentioned earlier, their brains are not developed to a point to understand the long-term implications of making those day-to-day decisions to consume those products. And sometimes they don't even have the ability to really make a choice, right? If it's what's available and what's affordable, then it's what they have to consume. It's not really up to them. And so it's important to note that the normalization of unhealthy eating is not something that individuals are always actively, consciously making a choice to do. It's shaped a lot by the factors that are in their neighborhoods and surround them on a day-to-day basis. So now to pivot a bit more and talk about my current work. So in terms of digital food marketing, there's a lot of areas for research exploration. I've just highlighted a few here that have really shaped my approach to this work. So first, a lot of food marketing research has looked, of course, at traditional food marketing, because that's what's been around for the most part until relatively recently. And so just to look at digital food marketing in general is something that is addressing a gap in the research literature. But importantly, part of why I'm interested in looking at adolescents isn't just because of all these other factors I mentioned before, the ubiquity of their use of the internet and social media, but it's also because there's actually not been that much research on adolescents specifically when we look at food marketing effects. And part of that has really been because there was a large effort to try to help provide research evidence to support advocacy and policy efforts to regulate food marketing. And the way that was able to be done was really linking a lot of these negative health outcomes in the short term and long term with the behaviors of younger children. And so for a long time, research actually showed that adolescents were able to kind of psychologically inoculate or like block the persuasive effects of food marketing. But it turns out over time, as more psychological research was done, that actually really wasn't the case. And there was more evidence that suggested that young people weren't able to kind of separate the persuasive effects of food marketing from, their actual behavior in a day-to-day. And so that's part of what I'm interested in doing is filling that gap and talking to adolescents and getting more information about their experiences with digital marketing and social media food marketing specifically in my case, in order to help continue to build the body of evidence that suggests that adolescents actually do need protections like regulation that we've done for younger kids. Second, like I said, there are disparities among Black and Latino adolescents. And by disparities, I'm referring to, the table I showed you before, disparities in obesity, in diabetes rates, and that's something that, again, is in the long term. And so the idea is to try to understand what are some of the factors preceding these longer term health outcomes that maybe could be intervened on in a public health approach. And so again, I'm in a behavioral science program. And so we're really interested in kind of understanding what are those factors that are shaping behavior and how can we promote healthier behavior. And I already kind of mentioned the digital food marketing piece in terms of that versus traditional food marketing. But I also just want to highlight that some of the things that researchers are looking more at now as digital food marketing becomes even more popular is they're trying to figure out how to measure exposure. So in other words, how many ads or how much marketing activity is someone exposed to? And I have to tell you, that is a really hard thing to measure. And you can probably imagine that if you're thinking about scrolling on social media, for example, you might see a lot of things that are ads that you are personally seeing on your device based on where you are or other things you've engaged with on social media. And so it becomes challenging because that is really proprietary information and researchers can't access it easily. So we've seen studies like someone having youth share their screen and they'll screen record them scrolling for 10 minutes to try to capture what their digital environment might look like because it's so unique and different per person. The other thing is we're trying to understand even more in the digital marketing sphere what some of the characteristics of digital food marketing that's targeting young people looks like, or what they are, and what the strategies look like. And so that's things like using teen actors or themes that really resonate with teens, like independence and creativity, and trying to figure out what are the ones that food and beverage companies are really using and leveraging to get them to purchase and consume products in order, again, to kind of try to get a better sense of how we can intervene on this and help prevent youth from falling into the trap of persuasive food marketing and its effects. And that kind of leads to my third subpoint there in terms of short and long-term impacts of exposure. So, like I said, we're just trying to understand in the research sphere now, specifically for digital food marketing, what actually are the long-term impacts, right? Digital food marketing has not been around that long. And so, and it's also really hard to tie a long-term outcome like obesity specifically to exposure to digital food marketing in one's youth, for example. And so trying to accumulate evidence to help build that causal chain to be able to say, yes, we can say that it's most likely the case that when someone's exposed to food marketing, which is largely for unhealthy food products, that leads to these outcomes. Other things to note, there's limited qualitative research in digital food marketing research in general. And there's a lack of consensus, again, because it's a really new research in terms of key terms and concepts and their definitions. Those are all things that are being sorted out still and makes it really challenging to replicate research. And replicating research is really important in order to, again, establish a really strong evidence base to advocate for policy and to build appropriate behavioral interventions. Lastly, there's a limited understanding of levers for behavior change. So again, if we're thinking about implementing some sort of behavioral intervention, we need to understand what are the actual things that need to change over time in order to change someone's behavior. And that's a really hard thing to uncover. So some of the ways I'm trying to address these gaps is through my dissertation research. And I'll just kind of breeze through this a little bit, but please feel free to ask questions. Our dissertation structure here at Brown requires like a 3-paper structure, if you're familiar with that. Basically, all that means is that there needs to be 3 separate parts that are all of publishable quality by the end. And so the very first part is addressing that gap I described in terms of lack of consensus on key concepts and definitions. And so I'll be reviewing literature over the last several decades to understand what research has found in terms of how exposure to social media food marketing actually influences things like attitudes, perceptions, and norms of food marketing among Black and Latino adolescents. And as a secondary aim to that review, I'll also be trying to summarize how these different key concepts are defined in order to help kind of shape my own research, but also to shape the field of research so that it has like more ability to compare studies. And because we're using similar measures or similar language, becomes easier to do that as consensus is built. And then papers 2 and 3 are related. They're part of a mixed method study. And so in the first part, I'll be conducting focus group discussions with Black and Latino adolescents in order to understand their breadth of experiences encountering social media food marketing in their daily lives. And through these conversations, I hope to identify potential psychosocial mediators. And by that, I mean things like attitudes and norms that are shaping ultimately how social media marketing is actually affecting their behavior over time. And so, like I said, trying to uncover those levers as much as possible. And again, this is like dissertation research. This is a pilot project, so it's a very small step in that direction, but trying to establish feasibility for a longer term project in the future. And then part 3, like I said, is related to part 2, and that's because I want to use the findings from part 2 to shape the questions that I ask in part 3. And part 3 will use a method called ecological momentary assessment. And basically what that allows me to do is to help attempt to capture real-time exposure to social media food marketing to address the challenges that I described earlier with measuring exposure. And it'll also help capture descriptive characteristics of social media food marketing. So those strategies I talked about before, like using teen actors or music that resonates with young people. And so what young people actually do in this study is they'll obviously receive training on how to do this, but they'll be submitting photos on their phone of ads that they're seeing on their own devices, and then filling out a short questionnaire about them. And so that's how I'll be able to capture kind of all these different components that I'm interested in. And similarly, trying to understand those psychosocial levers and other behavioral variables that might be relevant in terms of understanding how exactly exposure to food marketing ultimately influences intention to purchase or consume and the ultimate behavior of purchasing or consuming a marketed food product. Other ways that my work is kind of related to all of this and that I kind of seek to dive deeper is through teaching. So here at Brown, I've had the opportunity to teach for the summer pre-college program called Summer at Brown. And for that program, I actually developed a course called Consuming Culture, Food and Media Literacy. And it's a class where, or it's a media literacy class, but it's disguised a little bit because the teens have a chance to actually look at a variety of food media in order to learn media literacy skills. So trying to identify like who is the audience, what is the marketing message, what are they trying to get you to do? So some of those questions that you can ask yourself to help decode the persuasive intent of food marketing. And the photo on the left there is from one of the final projects from a group of students in the course I taught last summer. They were instructed to kind of create a counter marketing food material. And so you'll see in that image is a counter marketing flyer for Skittles where it highlights some of the ingredients in the product. And at the very bottom in small black font highlights some of the negative health outcomes that those ingredients are associated with. So things like cancer, heart disease, and obesity. And finally, I also have been teaching as an adjunct instructor for the NYU Department of Nutrition and Food Studies, where I got my master's degree. And there I've been teaching about racial equity in the food system. So not looking at marketing specifically, but again, kind of those economic, social, and political factors that shape dietary behavior, that shape the food system overall, and how that ties into the historical and contemporary legacy of things like structural racism in the food system. So some parting thoughts. In terms of things that folks in the audience might be able to do, things like raising awareness, just talking with people you know about how marketing works and what they're exposed to and how people are protecting themselves is a great way to just start engaging with this topic even more. Like I said, social media, food marketing, and digital food marketing even more broadly is ubiquitous. You're surrounded by it all the time. And so it can feel really overwhelming sometimes. And it can be helpful to talk to other people about ways that they're managing their attention spans and other things with regard to exposure to food marketing. The other is supporting media literacy education. So I just told you a little bit about what media literacy education might look like. A lot of schools are trying to implement this in their programming. So if that's something that you want to advocate for in your kids' school, that could be one approach. But also things like summer camps and their online programs that teach youth how to decode food media messages. And there's some evidence that suggests that media literacy skills may be able to have a little bit of a protective effect against the persuasive effects of food marketing exposure. And lastly, pushing for change at that higher kind of government level. So advocating for stronger regulation on marketing to minors and data privacy as well. So back to the history kind of part I spoke about much earlier, trying to extend those regulations to the digital sphere is something that a lot of folks are trying to advocate for, and not just to the digital sphere, but specifically for all young people. And finally, to wrap up everything I've basically said today, what teens eat is shaped by social, political, and economic factors. And ultimately, food marketing is one of those things. It influences their dietary behavior and their health in the short and long term. And digital marketing, specifically that which is administered through social media platforms and things like emerging technology, is of concern. And together we can take action to help protect youth from the health effects of exposure to a highly persuasive food environment. So with that, I will stop sharing my screen and we can pivot to any questions if folks put any in the chat, or if you didn't have a chance to yet, then I definitely encourage you to do so. Or rather in the Q&A. So one of the questions that was submitted beforehand was about government assistance programs. So someone asked, how can government assistance, for example, SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, work to increase access to healthy food? I think an important thing to say is that SNAP actually doesn't have a lot of regulations. Like you can use SNAP to purchase just about anything other than alcohol and pre-made food products. So things like a rotisserie chicken, like sometimes you can't purchase those with SNAP. So healthy food options are accessible with supplemental nutrition assistance. And I think that is like a common misconception, is that they're not necessarily accessible. The nutrition assistance itself is not creating a limitation in terms of what people are being able to access, right? A lot of times what's creating that limitation is actually someone's physical environment. So are they near a grocery store? Does a grocery store accept SNAP? Do they have fresh products? And that is the kind of thing at the built environment level that's really shaping access, and less so the actual benefits themselves. And another thing to mention in terms of SNAP is that there are requirements to qualify for these benefits. And so sometimes the work requirements are restrictive. And so that can limit people's access to healthy food, because they actually can't qualify for a program, even though it would be something that would really help them out. So for example, it depends on state to state, but you have to work for a certain number of hours for a certain period of time. So if someone's like lost their job multiple times over a period of a year, let's say, it can be challenging for them to actually qualify for the benefits in order to improve their access to begin with. So in terms of increasing access, I think reform for things like the work requirements to qualify for SNAP is one of the ways that could happen. Let's see, there's one question in the Q&A. So someone's curious about how I became interested in this field of study. Yeah, I can talk a little bit more about that. Honestly, my undergrad research experience at the UConn Red Center for Food Policy and Health was the way I got introduced to food marketing research as just like a general area. The Red Center has a variety of research areas they focus on. Food access is one, school food is another, weight stigma is another. And so I kind of just got this primer on food research topics. But food marketing at the time was really interesting to me, because you have to think about, being a college student. I was pretty close to the age of the students, or the age of the kids that were in the studies that the Red Center was doing. A lot of their research at the time was with teenagers. And so I felt like I could resonate a lot with what we were finding in our own research, and in the research I was reviewing to help support the research at the Red Center. And so part of just that interest spurred from a personal connection to the people, seeing myself in the Black and Latino youth that they were speaking to as an Afro-Latina myself, and also being able to think more about the disparate food environment conditions that I grew up in, and kind of interrogating that more, and just becoming curious about why different foods were more accessible in one place than another, and how those foods were being promoted, just kind of naturally followed from that. let's see, in terms of accounts or pages to get accurate information about food trends in teens, I think I'm not totally sure like if the question is about those two components together. I'll say like in terms of understanding like teens and their habits online, one of the places I go to a lot is the Pew Research Center. So they publish, I think it's an annual report on teen use of the internet and specifically social media. And they released a report not too long ago about that. And so it just talks about like the platforms that are most popular among young people and the time that they spend on the internet and on social media, which is increasing over time. And the platforms themselves are changing over time as well. Between the last report, which I think was 2022, and the most recent one, some platforms like Facebook are essentially obsolete compared to newer ones like Discord and Twitch are becoming increasingly popular. In terms of food kind of like trends, I think it kind of depends on what you mean by that. I mean, one place I go a lot to kind of understand what is going on in terms of changes in consumption patterns, not necessarily in teens, but just in the US in general, is honestly the USDA's website. They do have really clunky data that's hard to filter through, but they also publish these shorter blogs and reports that are really easy to read through and get high level information about how consumption patterns are changing. But generally, that's for produce and like products that can be grown, livestock, things like that. Not so much for ultra processed foods that are high in fat, salt, and sugar. And then, okay, another question. Has the food industry properly balanced the lowest price possible with its maximum nutritional value? I would argue like sometimes yes, but overall no. A lot of times the interest is again to produce foods that or to promote foods that are cheap to produce. And so the reason why that ends up being a lot of these unhealthy snacks is because things like produce, imagine like a tomato, right? Like if you have that growing, you have to then have someone pick it. So you have to pay the money for the labor for that. And then you have to transport it. And if you've ever had a tomato, you know that they can go bad relatively quickly. And so now you need temperature regulation in the truck. And so it becomes like all of these extra steps in order to get a piece of produce to a person compared to a product like corn that's maybe getting, sent somewhere to be processed into flour to make cornflakes or potatoes being turned into chips. It's fewer steps and much cheaper to do because it doesn't require all of these other things that more delicate produce does. And so, excuse me, I would argue that balancing that with nutritional value is just not really a top priority because again, price and profit is the bottom line. I will say though that corporations have developed some products that are really cheap that have better nutritional value over time. And that's been mostly as a result of pressure from parents, the public, advocacy groups, etc., who want healthier products. And so there have been a lot of different, what are they called? Like symbols, I would say, like that you can see on packages or like health claims that you can see on packages that used to not be as well regulated, but now are. I think the challenge is that the food and beverage industry often finds a lot of loopholes to these things. And so it can be challenging as a consumer to filter through kind of what's true and reliable and what's not. And so for that, I always kind of default to nutrition and dietetic professionals to kind of understand like what these claims mean and what I should be looking for on a nutrition label. Because again, the interest of these companies is to sell their products. And so if putting something like promotes bone health is helpful on a product, which they are allowed to do because they're not guaranteeing that a product promotes bone health, for example. But if that helps sell the product, that's why they're putting it on the product. And so I think it's important that we kind of filter through all of that information and remind ourselves that the bottom line is always profit. So we're just past 8 o'clock. So I just want to thank everyone who was able to join today, for popping in, and thank the folks at Govs, especially Ms. Housen, for inviting me. And thank you all so much.
Abby, thank you so much. I had the pleasure of talking with Abby a couple weeks ago when we spent probably a half hour on the Zoom, probably 20 of which we talked about this topic, and I went into a deep dive on like 3 or 4 different things that she had mentioned. So super interesting topic, at least to me, I feel. I hope you guys took some tidbits and again have some fun things to Google. Abby, I have a quick question. There was one website that you shared with me when we were on the Zoom about, it was more about like the farmers and like sort of like the things that are like just like policies and things that are changing and how it might affect like small farms, which I did spend a bunch of time on, which might be of interest to folks if you remember that one.
Yeah, one place that you can get a lot of really great food policy kind of reports is Civil Eats. They're an independent kind of journalism organization that focuses really specifically on the food system. And notably, recently, they've established a food policy tracker. So as a lot of programs have been cut from the USDA, or the funding's been threatened, they are the ones that have been keeping track of it. And so you can see what kinds of programs have been affected and understand what those impacts might be for the food system and for farming, specifically in the US context.
Thank you for sharing that again, because like I said, I spent some time on that after our Zoom and was sort of fascinated, because I worry about my personal CSA, so that's always of interest.
Yeah.
So
And it's really digestible, it's not like super dense. So
no, it
anyone
is.
can kind of pop on there and find something interesting, I think.
So thank you again, Abby, for spending this time with us and sharing your research, and super excited to see where it brings you in the next few years, for sure. But thank you again. And thank you all for joining. We have one more Passions in Practice in June, and then we'll take a little bit of a summer break, but John Shane will join us, class of 1985. For those of you who are at Govs when the Guild was happening, John Shane actually started the Guild, and he will sort of talk about his journey as a professional musician after leaving Gov. So hope that you can join us on June 18th at noon. But until then, enjoy your Memorial Day weekend in May and end of school year and all the great stuff that's happening at this time of the year. And we hope you'll join us in June. Thanks. Bye-bye.